All right, so welcome everybody. This is the second session of the courses here and we're running two classes simultaneously through these sessions. We've got one going on at Eastern West Virginia Community College. We've got one going on here in Marietta, Ohio, and I think a large number of the participants in that. Well, I was going to say a large number, but there are a group of people coming in from Athens, Ohio, but there are some others from West Virginia. And then there's Christy up there in New York State. So far flung. All right, well, let me jump in and really, again, the primary purpose of this, what happened? What happened to my video? Did I, let me change my video. I just see that
we can't see you.
There we go. Yeah, it jumped to a different camera. So, all right. So the primary purpose of this is to answer any questions that you guys have or issues that have come up as you're going through the studying. We should be through chapter 3 at this point. So if you're not, you're a little bit behind. If you're ahead, that's all good. Chapters 1 through 3, frankly, are fairly foundational. There's not a lot of things that are overly confusing. I don't want to poison the well by then having you guys come out and say, "Oh, I'm confused by this," and then you're going to feel silly about it. But it is pretty foundational. I'll just flip through and see if I note anything specifically. Chapter 1, just kind of a basic overview with photovoltaics. Prices are going down, installations are going up. If you were in the Solar Noon Tuesday today, I noticed just last year, solar increased, installations in the US increased 67%, which is dramatic and pretty amazing. I remember when I was first teaching this stuff back around 2011, 2012, and we would see 100% increase in installation of solar. And you go, okay, well, that's fine because it's a pretty small number. You know, we don't have that many. So you're seeing this exponential growth. But I would say this is not going to continue. We shouldn't be expecting to see this level continue, but really we are. We're still seeing it grow super dramatically, and that has some ramifications for all of you who are thinking about solar as a career, for sure, because it really is a career where all of the projections have always understated the need. So we have a workforce in solar of about 300,000 people. By 2030, which is only 6 years off, we need to triple that. We need to have more than 1 million people in the solar industry just to meet the projections that are out there today of what's required to hit the carbon emissions goals. When we look at the growth of solar, though some of them I recapped here today, in the previous meeting, we saw 33 gigawatts of installation this year. Well, that was about a quarter of all of the solar that's ever been installed in 1 year. So the entire industry. So every 4 years, we're doubling the installation base here in the U.S. So that's a lot of need of folks out there installing these systems. So the price or the wages are continually going up. Some of that has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act stated that if you've got a system that's 1 megawatt or larger, so that's 1,000 kilowatts in size, you have to pay prevailing wage if you're going to take advantage of the tax incentives. Well, nobody installing a system that size is not going to want to take advantage of those tax incentives. So what prevailing wage means is we see some of the folks, in fact, some people who went through the last class that I offered here in Marietta, getting hired on in solar projects where they were getting paid $42.50 an hour just to start on these large systems. And that's, I mean, if you annualize that, a 2,000 year I always think of annual salaries. Well, that's like $85,000 in an annualized salary, assuming no overtime. So that's pretty good wages for somebody starting out. Um, and um, and so and while that's for the larger systems, we're seeing that all of the people who install smaller systems in order to compete with those kind of wages are having to push up their wages as well. So I would guesstimate in this region, when I talk about this region, Southern Ohio, West Virginia, the salary, starting salary for a solar installer is going to be somewhere in the $25 an hour range. So, that's for doing residential installation. So that's pretty good for going through a 40-hour course. So we'll see. All right. So as far as demand curves, history of photovoltaics, not a lot there. Bell Labs. When I send you these recaps, the video recaps, it walks through the end of the chapter quizzes. So I don't really want to spend the time during these sessions going through the questions. You can do that on your own. But again, if there is a question, and there will be as we get deeper into some of these future chapters, where you say, that just didn't make any sense to me. The answer to that question didn't make any sense. This is kind of your opportunity to hit that. When we get into chapter 2, I'll try and hit the thing that I think most people tend to find confusing. And that's when we start talking about the standard test conditions and the IV curve and what is a VOC, what is a VMP, what is an ISC, what is an IMP, all of that kind of thing. So let me jump into sharing my whiteboard. See if you can. I get all of these. Yep, here we go. You guys can see the whiteboard there. I didn't. All right.
We can see a whiteboard. Yeah.
All right. So if I talk about an IV curve, and my drawing is going to be horrible, it's just a standard graph. There's the amps and there's the volts. So amps is designated with an I. The I stands for intensité de courant from French. I think that they I don't know why they used I instead of A, because if I were to say watts equals amps times volts, I write it like that. But if I say 60 watts equals 5 amps times, what would that be? 12 volts. Then I write it like that. So I use the A when I'm dealing with a specific number, but I use the I for amps when I'm dealing in the abstract. So I think it's really because angstroms already had an A, was using the A. But anyway, that's my assumption anyway. I'll stick with it. So the watts equals amps times volts is the power equation. And that is, whoop, there's my pen. All right, so I'm talking about the IV curve. So this is the IV curve. And obviously it's I for amps, V for volts. And then every single solar panel, if we plotted the watts it generated at different levels of amps and volts, it would have a curve. Looks something, I mean, it would be smoother than that, but it's difficult for me to write on here. It would look like that, sort of. And this is all in watts, because again, watts equals amps times volts. So this is just plotting amps times volts. So what is the theoretical maximum amps? It's going to be right up here. And that's going to be the ISC. That's the amps short circuit. So it's theoretical because notice 0 here, any number times 0 is going to equal 0. So at ISC, there's no watts being produced. The same is true over here at the VOC. That's the theoretical maximum voltage. that a solar panel could produce. And I should also point out that this IV curve that I'm writing here is at STC. It's only at one very specific set of conditions. STC assumes irradiance of 1,000 watts per square meter, temperature of 25 degrees Celsius, and a atmospheres of one and a half atmospheres. So basically it says, okay, we need to compare apples to apples. So let's set a certain parameter, a certain standard test condition, so we can compare one thing to one thing, so that one 300 watt panel is the same as another 300 watt panel. Doesn't really matter what the conditions are as long as everybody is consistent. So they said, let's do 1,000 watts per square meter, 25 degrees Celsius, and 1.5 atmospheres. So how did they come up with that? Well, the story I've always heard is they were meeting in Paris and they said, let's come up with a standard test conditions. And they said, what should it be? And they said, well, how about today? So they went outside in Paris, which happens to have about 1.5 atmospheres because it's fairly high up. That's basically how much atmosphere the sun has to come through to hit the ground. And then they said, okay, it's about 25 degrees Celsius. It's about 1,000 watts per square meter. That's a clear day with no clouds in the sky at sea level. And that's standard test conditions. Could have been anything, but that's what they selected. So, so this is our condition. Well, this is the theoretical maximum amps. This is the theoretical maximum voltage. These two conditions, these two numbers, are used when we design our system. So what we're worried about when we talk about the theoretical maximum amps, well, what primarily do we worry about for amps? We worry about for our wire size. Essentially, if we undersize the wire based on the amperage, the wire can burst into flames. You know, it'll get hot and it'll burn up. So we want to make sure that our wire is adequate for the amps that are flowing through it. So what amps do we use? Well, we use the worst case, which is the ISC. So it's just a design criteria. We use the VOC when we size our strings. Well, this is the theoretical maximum voltage, and the NEC says that a residential system has to be less, can be no greater than, so let me think, that's going to be a less than 600 volts DC. So I use this number when I'm configuring my system to make sure that under any circumstances, it does not exceed 600 volts. So these two numbers here are design criteria. So we use those. Now, somewhere along this curve, we're going to hit the maximum amount of power that's produced by this panel. And it's going to be somewhere in here. And it's easy to see how that works if we put some numbers to this. Let's say we say that that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the ISC is at 6 amps. And let's just throw 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and we'll say that's 30. So that's 30 volts. Okay, so if I operate at 5 volts, I would be somewhere right around here. 5 times 6 amps is going to be 30 watts, right? Everybody see that? If I increase the voltage to 10, well, the amps haven't fallen off much. So this is going to be somewhere around 60 watts. Well, that's more power. And if I increase it up to 15, let's assume that it hasn't really fallen off 6. 6 times 15 is 90 watts. Then I get up here to 20, and let's assume this 20 is at 5.5 amps. So 20 times 5.5, that's going to be, what is that, 110 watts? Now, let's assume I go to 25. and the 25 is at 4 amps. So that's going to be 100 watts. And if I get out here, let's say to at 2 amps and it's at about 29 volts, that's only going to be 58 watts. So you can see that these numbers increase, 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 increase. And at some point they reach a maximum, because then the numbers of watts start to decrease. Well, this point where it's at its maximum, let's assume that's it, is the maximum power point, or sometimes referred to as Pmax. So that is not the maximum amps or the maximum volts. It's the maximum power that panel will produce. And typically when we buy a 300 watt panel, that's the number they're referencing. So in this case, a 300 watt panel, the Pmax or the MPP will be 300 watts. So it is the wattage the panel will produce at the maximum power point under standard test conditions. That's how we rate our panels. So if I buy a 400 watt panel, it's going to be producing at that point, so on and so forth. Let me erase some of this stuff. So does that all sort of make sense? I'll see people nodding, maybe nodding off or nodding your head.
I have a question, Jay.
Sure thing.
What causes, and maybe I missed this, but what causes that decline in that curve?
Yeah, it has to do with internal resistive conflicts, basically. The best analogy I can give you is, let's say that watts is traffic flow through an intersection, and volts is the number of cars that you're adding coming in the two directions. And as I start adding more and more cars, the amount of traffic going through the intersection increases until it reaches a point where those cars start to interfere with each other and somebody taps the brake or whatever. And now for every car I add to that, actually I'm getting less traffic going through that intersection because they're all interfering with each other until you get to VOC, and that's pure total gridlock where nobody's moving anywhere, because you're getting these internal resistance, internal conflicts between, you're basically putting too many volts into the lane, too many cars in the lane. So it's just it's a matter of internal resistance in the circuits. So it's just a structure of the way these systems operate.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So your IV curve is always going to sort of look like that for a solar panel. It's going to be in that kind of shape. If we, let me see, can I double tap that and erase everything? Nope. All right. I think I can just go to I'll go to a new screen. All right. Now, let's see if this works. Really? It's gonna, there we go. So let's say this is my curve under STC. All right. If irradiance changes, so cloud cover comes out or whatever, but the temperature doesn't change, the new curve is going to look something like that.
Yeah.
It tends
Jay,
to, yeah.
We're still on the original graph, at least as far as what I can see.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see. How do I do that then? Did that change it at all? Nope.
So if everybody goes to the bottom right-hand corner where you see a little box that says 1 in blue, if you click that, it shows you his alternative pages, and you can go down to page 2.
There we are. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so irradiance is going to take you, it's going to change the curve like that. And let's say there's more cloud cover, it's going to change it like that. So we keep getting less and less, but the MPP, or the maximum power point, is going to keep moving around on this curve as irradiance changes and the like. If we had temperature changes, that affects voltage mostly. So if it got colder all of a sudden, my curve might look something like this. So now my MPP is out here somewhere. Well, how does it readjust itself? Within the inverter and within the charge controller, there's an item called the MPPT. It's the maximum power point tracking device, and it constantly is moving to the maximum power point. It's readjusting the maximum power point of that string coming in to be at the best it can be under the conditions it's currently facing. Okay, this is kind of an important point to understand. I just want to make sure that I've made it clear to everybody, because as conditions change, as cloud cover comes out, temperatures change and the like, where the panels operate at their best changes. And one of the problems with the old traditional string inverter systems is it treated the grid as a whole, you know, so that every panel was operating under the same maximum power point. And that's fine if you've got an array that's out in the middle of a field somewhere and they're all, you know, dealing with the same conditions. But let's say you've got partial shading on a specific panel, or, you know, trees, you know, in the morning, it shades part of it. Well, whatever happens to one panel happens to every panel when they're all connected together in a string. So this is one of the advantages of module level power electronics, or MPLEs. The two main ones we deal with are microinverters and power optimizers. And what this does is it essentially hooks up a piece of electronics to each and every panel, so that it sets that MPPT for each panel independently of every other panel. So that if one panel is shaded, it only affects that one panel. All right. So let me also illustrate something, and this is another slight change in the way we configure systems in recent years. Is it used to be that I would configure a system where, oops, I've still got the eraser. I would configure a system like this. I've got my solar array here, and I'm going to come in. Let's say I've got 3 strings coming into a combiner box. So this is the combiner box. Now, from a wire management standpoint, I would combine those strings, and then I would go, the next piece of equipment I would go to is a DC disconnect. And then I would go to my inverter. Okay, from the inverter, this is a straight grid-tied system. I go to an AC disconnect, because now we're in the world of AC. Then I would go to my service panel. I would hook it into a double pole breaker here in my service panel. And then this is my main, and the main goes out to a utility meter, and then it goes out to the grid. So this is a standard old grid-tied system. Very, very uniform. This is what we used to install back in 2012, back in the olden days, you know, when I bought these socks that I'm wearing. So so we would go like this, and we would hook into a combiner box. Well, what's the beauty of that? Well, in this case, I'm coming in with 3 different wires. Let's say that the wire amperage for each of these was 10 amps. So I've calculated the wire, and it's 10 amps each. Then I combine them in parallel, and I'm leaving with a 30 amp wire. So I ended up with 1 larger wire. But instead of having 6 pair of wires, I'm just having 1 pair of wires, even though they're a little bit bigger. So from a standard wire management, this all made perfect sense. And this this section of the design from the combiner box to the DC disconnect is usually the longest section. It's the section that's from the roof down into your basement if it's on a home, or it could be out in a field for a standalone and it's going to take it all the way to the house. So this could be 30 feet or 300 feet, that one section. So we wanted to minimize the amount of wire. Well, the problem with that is each of these strings has its own MPPT or its own MPP, its own maximum power point. Every time I've connected these panels together, I've made each of those panels now the average, or basically the worst case scenario. So if one of the panels in that string is shaded, all of the panels in that string are effectively shaded. Now I hook them together in parallel. Now every panel in that array is shaded. I could have shade just covering one little corner over here of my array because there's a tree and the angle of the sun and the like. It affected one string, so this string here is affected. But then when I combine them in parallel, all strings are affected. So one panel being shaded is going to reduce significantly the output of the entire array. Well, that's
definitely parallel, not series.
Yeah, when I do it in a combiner box, it's definitely a parallel connection.
From the combiner box to the DC.
Yeah. That's a parallel.
Okay, because I was thinking you meant coming from the panel to the combiner box. If those are all individual.
No, those are in
Okay.
series. Those are in series. So I might have 10 panels in each string. And so that series is a series, but it still affects the one string. So when I connect in series, it affects it as well as far as the shading. But now I've got 3 strings of 10. Well, now I've got 1 string of 30, essentially. And so what happens to one panel happens to all of them. So what we ended up doing in the evolution of this industry is they said, you know what, we saved a little bit of money on the wire, but we cost a lot of production in our solar array. So it kind of makes sense. I'm going to put in this inverter 3 MPPT tracking devices. So I basically have places where I could connect in 3 strings in this inverter. So then we started saying, okay, let's not do a combiner box anymore. Let's do a junction box. It's just a transition from one type of wire to another, but we're not doing any parallel connections. And then let's run three sets of wires down and run 3 sets of wires into our inverter. And the advantage of that is now each string behaves independently of the other strings. So that was all good. Problem is, took more wire, and we had to get a little bit more complicated DC disconnect, because we're now disconnecting 3 strings instead of 1. But this was sort of step 2 in the evolution of how these systems were designed. So we ran these strings, and you'll still run across string inverters that operate this way, mostly in ground-mounted systems. Okay, then what ended up happening is we got into, in 2014, they did what we referred to as rapid shutdown. I may be jumping a little bit ahead, but I'm on a roll, so I'll jump ahead and then you'll have a preview. All right, if I get rid of all of this, because I don't want everybody to have to jump to new screens. All right, how do I get rid of it? Come on, there we go. Used to be on one of them that's not part of Zoom, you can just double click on the eraser and the whole thing disappears, which is a lot easier than trying to do this. All right, so rapid shutdown. What was the concept behind rapid shutdown? Well, it's important to understand what the issue was. First thing, let's say we've got a house. So this is the house, and here's the solar array. here. It's up on the roof. And this is the ground level. And our service panel is on the wall down in the basement somewhere. Okay, this was a pretty typical American residential kind of situation. All right, so you've got the solar array up on the roof, you've got your service panel down in the basement. So how do we run this system? Well, we do a string inverter. So we're going to go to a combiner box or a junction box, and we usually hide that underneath the array. Just aesthetically, it looks better. And then we drill a hole through the roof and we go into the attic and we start running our wires. And the wires could go down inside the wall cavity. Certainly in new construction, it would. Might have to come outside and go down the side of the building and then back in, or there might be a way. But let's assume that we're running it. Let's just say we run it over here and then we run it down inside the wall and we come all the way into the basement. And the first thing we have to do is we're going to go to a DC disconnect. And then we go to our inverter. It's all on the wall in the basement again. And then we're going to go outside, and on the wall out here next to the electric meter, we're going to put our AC disconnect. And then we're going to run from the AC disconnect and we're going to connect into the service panel. So that would be a fairly typical way that we would do this. We'd be drilling a couple of holes in the wall. We'd be drilling a hole in the roof. We come down. All right, this all works just fine. Now, what happens when they come? Let's say that the house now suddenly catches on fire. It's the middle of the day and the house has burst into flames. Bad news. So the first responders come. The first thing that they're going to do when they arrive on the scene is they run to the utility meter and they pull the meter. They basically just pop the meter out of its socket. That's effectively disconnects the house from the grid. So there's no electricity now in the house. They look around and they see this little label on the meter and it says, oh, hey, you've got a solar array here as well. The AC disconnect needs to be located within 10 feet of the meter. So they turn off the AC disconnect. That turns off the solar array. Okay, that's the whole point of it. Now, in theory, the solar array should have shut off as soon as it was disconnected from the grid, but let's just assume, you covered all bases. Well, where did the solar array turn off? It turned off at the inverter, because that's where the anti-islanding is located. That's where the switch is. So when the inverter senses the grid is gone, we turn off at the inverter. But remember, the sun is shining. So all of these wires going up through the house, under the roof, from the array to the inverter, those are live wires. Okay, those could be 600 volts DC electricity. And they're hot. Even though the system is turned off, it's not generating any AC power, but those wires are still hot. So the first responder climbs up on the roof and he decides he's going to vent the building by running a chainsaw right through the roof, cutting a hole in the roof, which is another thing they do. And he cuts through a 600 volt wire and he dies. Okay, and this was the fear. So in 2014, the NEC said, you know what? When we turn off this AC disconnect, we don't want the system to power down at the inverter. We want it to power down at the array to protect these first responders. And the industry in 2014 basically said, how do we do that? How do we make that happen? And the National Electrical Code said, that's really not our problem. Do it. Make it so. So in 2014, they came up, well, on a commercial roof, what they thought of was the first step was, you know what, let's not put the inverter in the basement. Let's stick the inverter right up here next to the array. Now everything's shut off right at the array. But the problem is on a regular house with shingles and a sloped roof, trying to stick a 70-pound inverter up on the roof, first off, it's going to look silly, but it's also going to be very impractical. So then a company called Enphase got this bright idea of saying, instead of having one big inverter, why don't we have little tiny inverters and attach them to every single panel? And thus the industry of microinverters was created. So now if you have this array, you've got a whole bunch of little microinverters. Well, that worked, right? Because as soon as you disconnect from the grid, it disconnects up there at the array because the inverter's connected directly to the panel. Problem is, it was pretty pricey, right? If you figure each one of these little microinverters cost about $200 and you had 20 of them, you know, now you're up in the $4,000 range for an inverter. It's pretty expensive. So then a company called Enphase, or not Enphase, but Solar Edge said, you know what we could do? We could put, instead of the inverter up there, we can put the disconnect, the anti-islanding sensor that's in the inverter that shuts off when it loses sight of the grid. We could put that in a little electronic device and attach that to each panel. And while we're at it, why not put the MPPT up there in that electronic devices as well, so that each of these operate independently of each other? And while we're at it, why don't we put in a communication device so you can monitor your panel's performance individually? So they're going, hey, this is great. We can do this. We can still have an inverter that's down in the basement, but we can make these little electronic devices not for $200, but we can just charge like $60 for them. And you're going to get better performance and you're going to get that rapid shutdown requirement. So really at that point, the only two ways you could comply with this is put a microinverter up there, put a power optimizer, which was Solar Edge, or some people came up with this thing. It was almost like an emergency button, like you see at gas stations when, you know, if the pump's going crazy, it was just a button you pressed and it had a Cat6 wire and it was connected up here to the junction box and it basically turned it off. It flipped a breaker. So you could just stop the signal at the array. So that was the third option. The problem was those were pretty expensive. They were like $2,000. So ultimately in the 2017, it said you can't even do that. It's got to be, you've got to connect an electronic device to the panel if it's in a house that somebody is living in, or if somebody lives in the building or is in the building, then you've got to have what's referred to as rapid shutdown. This doesn't apply to ground mounted systems because nobody lives under the solar array. So this was really just a safety thing for the industry, for the first responders. Well, today about 75% or better, 75 to 80% of all of the residential systems installed are either going to be using microinverters or power optimizers. That's just standard now. And that all came about because of the rapid shutdown requirement that came about by the NEC, the regulation there. Does that all sort of make sense? Let me stop the sharing. Okay. So that was a long way of getting to amps, volts, watts equals amps times volts. Okay, then chapter 3, really here you're just being introduced to the concept that there are different sort of flavors of solar arrays that go on homes. The one we talk about mostly in this industry is the grid tied, the simple grid tied system. That's the cheapest system. It is the one. Hey Chad, how you doing, man? So anyway, the simple grid tied system, when we talk about these things cost $3 a watt or whatever, we're talking about a simple grid tied system. When the grid goes down because of anti-islanding, right? The system, the inverter is designed to shut off when it doesn't see the grid so that you're not feeding power back onto the grid and possibly killing a lineman who's out there trying to repair the grid. So with a simple grid tied system, the grid goes down, you don't have power either. Your system is not producing power. So that's something that people have a hard time getting their head around because they think, okay, well, I've installed solar, so now I have power. And the grid goes down and they don't have power. And then they say, hey, you guys installed this system. I was supposed to have power when the grid goes down. You say, no, we told you. Anti-islanding, you can't feed onto the grid. It only works when the grid is operational. And then they say, well, but I wanted power. Say, yeah, but you remember I told you could do that, but it was going to cost twice as much. And you said, no, I don't want to spend twice as much. So you get into those kind of communications. So, okay, so a simple grid tied system, when the grid goes down, it's down. Your system's down. It's not producing. So the alternative to that, the other extreme, is a system like what Christie's dealing with up there in New York. And this is something, in fact, on the call, they were talking about. The utility wants a lot of money to connect your home to the grid. I don't know. Christy, how much did they want to connect your house up there in New York to the grid?
I think it was going to be close to like 30,000.
$30,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we see $50,000, even more. So in a situation like that, logically, Christy goes, well, I could pay the utility company $30,000 and then for the wonderful privilege of paying them for electricity, or I could install my own system off grid. And it will cost less than that. You could spend that much and more if you really wanted a huge system. But so it's a financial decision. All right. If you're far away from the grid, maybe it's not available. Maybe it's too expensive to hook up to. You do a standalone. So you've got grid tied where where your system doesn't operate when the grid goes down, or you've got a standalone system that operates regardless of what's happening on the grid. Grid could be functioning, the grid could be not functioning. You don't know, you don't care. You're independent. You're a little island all unto yourself. Then there's a third option, somewhere between the two. And there are basically two choices within this third option. We usually call those grid interactive systems, but increasingly they're referring to those as AC coupled or DC coupled systems. And what that does is like the best of both worlds. You are hooked up to the grid, but if the grid goes down, you disconnect from the grid and then you operate as a standalone system. So it could be an AC coupled system or a DC coupled system. The difference is, how is the power coming in? Essentially, I'm trying to think where that makes, if you're using a microinverter system or you already have a solar array installed, it's going to be an AC coupled system because you're already generating AC power. The microinverters, they generate AC power directly from the panel. When that power leaves the panel, it's leaving at 240 volts AC. If you've got an inverter already in place, it's leaving the inverter at 240 AC. Now you want to hook up a backup system. Well, that involves another inverter and another battery or a battery system of some sort. So let me share the screen again here. Let's see. Oh, there's the whiteboard. All right. So if I have, let's assume I've got a microinverter system, and this is the most common. And each of these panels here has a little microinverter attached to it. And all the power, it comes in with a N-phase system. It's going to come into an N-phase combiner box. And the combiner box has the communication device and everything else in it. From this combiner box, you're going to go to an AC disconnect. That's going to be outside next to your meter. So let's assume the service meter is out there. It's got to be within 10 feet, externally operable, well marked, lockable. You don't have to put a lock on it, but it's got to be lockable. And then from this AC disconnect, if we're making this into an AC coupled system, if it was just a straight grid tied system, I would then go straight into my service panel here. This would be my main, and that would connect out there. A very, very simple system. Panels with microinverters, a combiner box, AC disconnect to your load. That's all it is. But now I'm making it into an AC coupled system, so life becomes a little more complicated. So what do we go through here? We go into what's referred to as a smart switch or an auto transformer. So this is your switch. And this is like the brains of the whole operation. And then we connect in our load here. And then that's going to go from your main and it's going to go out to the meter that's by that AC disconnect. And then typically what you're going to do is there's going to be a sub panel. This will actually come in as the main breaker. And there will be loads that you want to have operate when the grid is down. Okay, so so power is coming in from the array, boom, 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 boom. And while the grid is operational, it connects to both of these. Its power is flowing in all directions under this scenario. So if the load goes out here to a light bulb, that could be on. Load going out here to a light bulb. My light bulbs are very strange. That could be on. And if I have all of the power here is being used, and if I have excess power, it's going back to the grid. If I need power, the grid acts like a big battery, and I pull from the grid. So it's going bidirectionally there. All right, so now the grid goes down. What happens? Well, first off, there is no power coming in from the grid or leaving to the grid because we've disconnected. Oops, I disconnected my switch. I basically eliminated this connection. I'll draw back in the box. All right, so now only the power is going in here into that. Now, one other thing I should have put in here that I forgot is battery. So the battery goes in here and it's connecting in there too. So now we've disconnected here. We're not connected to the grid anymore. These loads are not going to operate, but these loads still will operate. These are we used to refer to them a lot as critical loads, but the nomenclature is now like these are backup loads, because critical loads tend to indicate things that you couldn't live without, like heart monitors or whatever, and so some of these engineers get really fussy about terms. But anyway, when the grid is down, this thing disconnects from the main. You're no longer in any threat of feeding power back to the grid, and you're going to operate off of your batteries, off of your array, and all of that here. Now, with an N-phase system, it should be interesting, or you should note that the battery bank, and this is why we usually call these energy storage systems and not batteries, is there's more in this battery bank than just a battery. There are additional microinverters in there. There's power management systems. There's a lot of stuff in that battery bank because the power coming from here is AC, but to go into the battery, it's got to go from AC to DC. So this management system controls that and charges AC to DC. But then when you need the power from the battery, it's got these little built-in inverters and it converts it from DC to AC to feed back out. So it's a unit, it's a inverter charger unit that's all built into this. So this would be an AC coupled system. So that's a fairly typical AC coupled system. That's an N-phase system. Okay, a DC coupled system is, let's see, this is going to take, see what I can get rid of. I'll keep it messy. All right. Okay, so where do we do? Well, in this case, we're going to a junction box or a combiner box. It wouldn't be a AC disconnect, it would be a DC disconnect. And then we'd have our inverter here. Now, typically the DC disconnect is built into the inverter anymore. Now, it used to be in some of these systems, the switch was built in to the inverter. But in most cases now, it goes from the DC disconnect or from the inverter to an AC disconnect again that's out by your meter, and then it goes to a switch. So from that point forward, it's pretty much the same. And then there's a battery bank, but the battery bank is connected in here to the inverter usually. And then this one goes, the switch goes to your main panel. It goes out to your meter. And then it also goes to your sub panel. And all of the things take place here. This disconnects from the grid when the grid goes down and you're in island mode again. The main difference between a DC disconnect or a DC coupled system and an AC coupled system is with an AC coupled system, you go from DC at the panel to AC at the inverter to DC at the battery. And then from the battery, you go from DC to AC again. So there's several steps, DC to AC, AC to DC, DC to AC. With a DC coupled system, it's DC at the panel, feeds the inverter, it feeds the battery, it's still DC, and then the inverter converts everything over to AC. So there's only one conversion step. With an AC coupled system, you might have as many as 6 conversion steps. So the people who sell DC systems, they're going to tell you that theirs is the best because it's more efficient. Every time you convert from AC to DC, you lose some power. Every time you convert from DC to AC, AC to DC, you're losing some power. Well, back in the day where it took 10% of the power to make that conversion, it didn't make any sense to have an AC coupled system because you might lose 40% of your power before you've ever gotten it to the outlet. But today, the N-phase systems are about 99% efficient. So you're only going to lose about 1% in the conversion process. So now you're talking a difference with a DC coupled system of about 98% efficient and an AC coupled might be, say, 95% efficient. Not that big a deal. So now it's just whatever preference, whatever product you're going to select. But they're both out there. They're both viable. And increasingly, they're more common. They're definitely more expensive. So how do I stop that? Close the whiteboard. Yeah. So, the cheapest, least costly system is going to be grid tied, simple grid tied. The second cheapest, least costly is probably going to be a DC coupled system, followed closely by an AC coupled system. And then the most expensive is going to be a standalone system, because you're basically having to have batteries that support your entire load. And it's the batteries that cost most of the money. All right, I've managed to ramble on. Anybody have any questions before we call it a session?
This is probably further on down the line, but with your critical / backup loads on a separate panel, what's the wiring setup after that so that it's more distributed? So if you got a refrigerator running off your normal everyday power and you lose your grid power, now how does that that conversion go over to the refrigerator to the critical load panel?
I would put my refrigerator in the critical load panel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you have to decide which are the loads that you can't live without when the power goes out, and those all get located over into the critical load panel.
Okay.
There's one option that I didn't mention that Enphase has now, which is a sunlight backup option, where it's basically an AC coupled system without batteries. So as long as the sun is shining, your array will work, and it'll work in a standalone mode. It's limited, however, because obviously it's limited to the amount of power that's being produced by your array. So that's another option. We have that here at our office. And so when we set up our critical loads, we only moved over 4 loads into the critical load panel. We moved over our refrigerator. We moved over the fan and controllers of the furnace, because it's a gas furnace, but it still has blower fans and thermostats and all of that. So that's in the critical load. We moved over the sump pump in the basement just in case it's flooding and there's an event like that. And then the 4th load was my office up here where I'm sitting that has the modem and has some outlets. So we can run extension cords or whatever if we need to. But so it's just those 4 loads. If I were doing it with batteries, I'd probably add some more loads. And the other cool thing with the Enphase is it allows you to then prioritize those loads based on available sunlight. So I would say first priority is the furnace, let's say. Second priority is the refrigerator. Third is whatever. And so if there's not enough power to run all of them, it's going to run based on your priority schedule. So, that's, and they want you to deal with sizing issues. They don't want you to go to more than 30% of whatever your capacity is for those. But now this year, I'm hoping I'm probably going to add a battery into it. And at that point, all that stuff kind of goes away. Now I can back up other things because I've got battery there that supplements the sunlight. So, Wayne, you had a question?
Oh, I just had a couple thoughts. Like these days we have 90+ furnaces. So those are going to be more electrically efficient. They're using DC motors instead of AC motors. So you don't have to worry about capacitors and all that kind of stuff to get it to go. So that would work better on putting those on a loaded system like that. But originally it's kind of slightly, I used to work at a hospital where we had backup power for a generator in case it went down and enough fuel for 3 days. We had red outlets, 1 in each room. And so if we needed something that specifically needed backup power, we could plug into that. And it was totally autonomous from the rest of the electrical grid. So that way there wasn't a chance,
Yeah.
So I was wondering if anyone's ever designed a home that, even though it would make more sense to grid tie it, if someone's built a home where it's like, okay, these are my solar outlets not attached to the grid, and then just in case I have the grid outlets, you could have red and standard color. Has anybody ever done like 2 autonomous systems within a house?
No,
Have you ever heard of that?
I've never heard of that. Doesn't mean somebody didn't do it. I had a thought in another vein, sort of back when we were dealing with the conversion from AC to DC. Well, solar generates DC. You're just mentioning like DC motors. There's DC lighting.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
DC
Or LEDs.
appliances. Well, why do we have AC and DC? Why couldn't we have a DC outlet and an AC outlet? And then you avoid the conversion for that. That seemed to make a sense. But then as the efficiency of the conversion gets better and better, and it's sort of like USB cables, universal serial whatever, but there are 17 different varieties of these universal plugs. So as soon as we came up with a DC outlet, somebody would change it for some reason. And now none of my things work in any of the plugs. So I think we're kind of stuck. You know, we talk about why do we use AC electricity instead of DC? It really is because Tesla was smarter than Edison. You know, that's why we use it. We use it because we use it. And if we
Ben
use,
Franklin's house and his lights are still running off of DC power. Was
yeah,
a couple hundred years later, so they
yeah,
still work.
yeah, yeah. But you know, we'll blame it on New York because this all happened up in Niagara Falls. You know, where they wanted to run power from Niagara Falls to Buffalo, New York, and Tesla and Westinghouse figured out with AC you could run it through transformers, and with DC you had to have substations every 2 or 3 miles. So that's why we use AC. It's because of Buffalo, New York. So all right, I think that's kind of it here for the next week. We should be on to chapters 4 and I think part of chapter 5. So if you have any questions throughout the week, feel free to send me an email so that you don't have to, or wait for Tuesday, or you can just write it down and bring it up on Tuesday, and we'll keep plugging away. All right. So see you guys later. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jay.
Bye-bye.